Since their initial release in 1997, the Sisters of Battle have rapidly become a fan favourite amongst 40k fans, and many were introduced to the Daughters of the Emperor due to the 2020 pandemic, myself included. Since then, a great number of models have been released, like the Paragon War suits and the Sister Dogmata. Luckily, some of the older models also made their way into plastic, like this Seraphim squad member that I got as part of Imperium issue 54. So I'm going to be completely honest. I've had this model for a couple of months now, and I've been wanting to make something really cool out of it, but I could never really settle on an idea. So I did what I think anybody in my position would do, and I went online and had a look at all the different Adeptus Sororitas orders that I could find online, see if any of them would jump out at me. So I did a bit of digging online, and I actually came across a homebrew order called the VALKYRIES of Varnir. And this order really jumped out at me because I quite like Norse mythology, and this is following a lot of those tropes. So I felt there was a lot of potential. But that's enough waffling about all that. Let's get into how I did this conversion. First things first, I knew I was going to need a replacement head for this Sister Battle. Anybody who's worked on them in the past will know how poor quality the Games Workshop heads are. So I picked up these ones from Statuesque Miniatures on Etsy. To set this model apart from any other models part of the Imperium, I first began removing all the iconography from the model, which includes the Aquila and the fleur-de-lis seen on both shoulder pads and also on the left knee. If you're going to be following along at home, I recommend you use a very sharp knife. I didn't, and I paid the price. To make a bit of room on the back of the model, I chopped away part of the piping that usually connects to the jump pack. I shaved this away, just dry fitting every now and then just to make sure that the wings fit nice and snug. The wings were then attached using regular super glue, as plastic cement will not work with the resin. Once they were nice and secure, I mixed up a small batch of green stuff. This was so that I could attach the head, as the peg underneath the head was not long enough to just simply super glue to the model. Now, the eagle-eyed among you are going to notice a bit of a jump here, going from a gun to a shield. And as always, I'm going to be completely honest, I don't know what happened to that footage. But to briefly explain, I cut away the gun using my snippers, drilled a hole through the hand, and then inserted some paper clip, bent it and attached to a skeleton warrior shield. Now it's finally time to start breaking out the real green stuff. I make sure that I remove the inner part of it, the bit in the middle where the blue meets the yellow, as this can make the mix a little bit clumpy where it's set. In some cases this can be good, having the clumpy bits, but in this case I'm going to be sculpting some fur around the armour. So I want to make nice, smooth green stuff. Now, if you've seen any conversion videos in the past, you'll know that people usually recommend using Vaseline on your tools to help it stop sticking to them. But I also found a technique online, as you'll see here, using a toothpick. Anytime you see that the toothpick is not on screen, it's in my mouth. The saliva is a lot easier to use, and you don't really have to wash it as much as you would with the Vaseline, because the Vaseline tends to be a lot more oily and harder to get off. Now, what I found when you're trying to sculpt fur is you don't want to be trying to sculpt individual hairs. You're going to want to make it look a bit clumpy, because if you look at any of the official Games Workshop models, there's not many hairs. It's all in little clumps. And if you look at yourself in the mirror from far away, you're not going to see individual hairs. And as you can see, the result of sculpting this way is pretty good. So I left that to cure overnight and began working on the base. If you know me, I really like using cork for my bases, as it is cheap and it makes really good rock. So I snapped it into smaller pieces that I could attach directly onto the base using some regular super glue. And originally, to gnarl up the edges, I was trying to use my craft knife, which explains why it's never sharp, but I did eventually move on to using a pair of tweezers, and surprisingly this did a hell of a better job. It did eventually cause a bit of a mess, but one of the perks is I can sweep up all these little bits, add them into a jar, and I've got tiny bits of rubble. Chances are you've seen the EE top-up card in the background, and that is there because I was originally going to do a painted background where I was going to heat up the styrene, bend it into shape and paint a background on there, but I eventually changed my mind and stuck with just the cork base. I then filled any gaps with some polyfiller, which is literally just a gap filler. I tried applying this with some metal sculpting tools, but I eventually moved on to just using a really cheap paintbrush. From what I remember, polyfiller is actually quite cheap. I don't know whether that's still the case. To help smooth out some of the transitions, I then wet the paintbrush and gently stippled across the surface. To finish off the base, I added some dirt that I collected from the woods. I did this while the gap filler was still a little bit wet, just to give it a better chance of sticking. I later sprayed the entirety of the base with isopropyl alcohol and some watered down PVA, just to make sure that these parts weren't going to be going anywhere. After a little bit of cleanup, it was time to start working on the hair, so once again I broke out the green stuff. When I was working on the hair, I used a lot of the same techniques that I did for the fur, making sure that I wasn't sculpting individual hairs and making more clumps more than anything. To make it look the best that I could, I made sure that I had plenty of references that I found on Google. The main thing that I seemed to struggle with when I was sculpting this hair was working in some braids, but after a bit of patience, I think I finally achieved it. If you want a more in-depth tutorial on how to sculpt hair, I'm going to leave a link in the description to somebody I found on YouTube. I felt that the hair was lacking a little bit of something, so I also sculpted on a small ponytail. And after that I left it to cure and came to prime it the next morning. Like a lot of my smaller models, I tend to use Vallejo surface primer through an airbrush. This is just to ensure that I'm not having to rely on the weather, which in England is not always the best. While using the airbrush, make sure to always be wearing a respirator. After achieving full coverage with the primer and allowing it to dry fully, I then moved on to Sotek Green, which I focused more on the underside of the model. I used this to make sure that the scene looked a little bit more ambient and to hint at some reflections that are going to come from the snow a bit later. It's also going to work in our favour because we're going to be spraying from the front and above using a contrasting colour, which is Fire Dragon Bright. I chose to use this colour as I felt that it'd make the piece look a hell of a lot more cinematic, and to also hint at the possibility of either a sunrise or a sunset. Now that we're done with the airbrush, it is finally time to do some hand painting. To start this, I am using Bugman's Glow in all the shadows of the face. I made sure that I was working in nice thin coats, as this would help the gradient and also help some of that underpainting show through. After I'd got nice coverage with Bugman's Glow, I then slowly started to build up a highlight towards Flayed One Flesh. I made sure to be moving the model around quite a bit just to make sure that all the highlights were falling in the right place. This is, after all, a display piece, so I wanted to make sure that it looked good from all angles, not just the main money shot at the end. You can really see the benefits of using that underpainting and different dynamic lights here. Really looks cinematic to me. Then it was time for the part that people seem to really hate, and that's painting the eyes. I made sure that I painted them black first, as I'm not going to be able to get in there later and paint any eyelashes. It's easier to start with the black, build up the layers with the white later. Any mistakes can be covered up a bit later by adding more layers of the skin tone. But even so, you're going to want to take your time with this. For the hair, I decided that with the choice of colours that I've already made, that I was going to make this girl a redhead. To do that in the darkest parts, I mixed equal parts of Mephiston Red and Cantor Blue. And on the higher parts, I used just Mephiston Red, and slowly began highlighting up, mixing in more of that Fire Dragon Bright. Once again, I made sure that my layers were nice and thin to allow that underpainting to show through, and made sure that each layer dried in between. So I do actually have some Sisters of Battle left, so if you have any ideas for any more conversions you want to see me do with them, let me know in the comments. With the hair now finished, we are getting really close to finishing this model. So I then worked on the robes, starting off with some Cantor Blue again, keeping it nice and thin, and highlighting more towards the bottom using a bit of that Sotek green. I did this to make sure that I was leaning more into that dynamic light and also possible reflections from the snow. Originally the blue robes came from the concept art that I found on the homebrew page, which featured blue robes, black armour, but I wasn't sure how metallics were going to look with the ambient lighting, so I stuck with the main colours from them. I thought maybe doing it this way would make a bit more sense, as black metallics tend to reflect a fair bit of light, so I just stuck with the ambient lights that I already had. Saves on painting, saves on time. If any of you know how I could have done this using the black metallics, please let me know. It's something that I really want to try out at some point. With the main bit of painting done, it's time to make some snow, and you don't have to buy the deer stuff, you can just make it yourself really cheap. So I mixed in some bicarbonate of soda and some glossy Mod Podge. I made sure that I was mixing in a bit more Mod Podge than I was using bicarbonate of soda, and this is to make it look like the snow's melted a little bit where that warmer light is sitting. Now you don't really need any special tools to do this. I literally used a ice cream lolly stick, and this did it quite good. Looking back, I've hidden quite a bit of detail by adding the snow on, so probably less is more if you're going to be following along. Once I was happy at the time with how much snow I had, I then moved on to some straight bicarbonate of soda just to make the powdered snow sitting on top.